Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webcast on the use of EPRI's US REGEN model for long-range transmission planning. My name is David Young. I'm the manager of the Energy Systems and Climate Analysis Group here at EPRI, and I'm joined by my colleague, Nidhi Stantin, who leads our Integrated Planning Group. Today's agenda will be brief. I want to cover first the drivers of change to the electric sector through 2050. Why do scenario analysis? That's because we're seeing significant structural changes in the near and long terms that could significantly change where and when to build transmission. Following that, we'll talk about EPRI's US REGEN model, a little bit about the history, the coverage, and the kinds of drivers that it can represent within the modeling tool. And then from there, we'll turn to my colleague to talk about scenario analysis, the link from scenario analysis to transmission planning. And we'll finish up with a final slide and contact details. So again, very glad that you can join us all today. And now let's turn straight to the presentation. I think everyone in the audience here is familiar that there are significant changes underway in the electric sector with the change to decarbonization. Many drivers of that. We have electric companies' CO2 goals, those voluntary targets, a lot of those driven by stakeholder pressure. That's the left-hand panel there. In the middle panel, we see a representation of the Inflation Reduction Act, just one of many proposed federal policies over the past few years, but this is the first one to be actually enacted into law. But keep in mind that, of course, this may not be the only one going forward. There have been plenty of proposals for carbon taxes, clean energy standards, and other types of policies. And then on the right-hand side, we see a representation of recent state policies focused on CO2, particularly with relation to the electric sector. This figure is actually a year or two out of date, but just in many cases, state policies are one of the key drivers for electric company decisions in decarbonizing. So what we're seeing here is that with decarbonization well underway, there will be significant changes in the electricity mix going through to 2050. And that in turn has significant implications for planning and transmission planning in particular. So one of the consequences of the decarbonization transition is some serious structural changes to end use. And I have here a few panels to illustrate some of those changes that we see and that we actually represent in EPRI's US REGEN model. On the left-hand side, we see a graphic from EPRI's US National Electrification Assessment done in 2018. And since updated, the basic results are pretty much the same, showing that there could be significant electrification between now and 2050 across vehicles, buildings, and industry, even assuming pretty serious energy efficiency in the same time frame. And it's not just the fact that electrification is going to increase, projected to increase. It's really that the shape of that load could be changing over time. In our modeling, we see many regions moving from a summer peak to a winter peak, as well as the absolute peak increasing dramatically. And then we see, as the uptake of electric vehicles and heat pumps means that we see electrification in different regions than historically may have occurred. So new sources of load growth where they traditionally did not arise. In the bottom panel there, we see also climate impacts. I think there's been a lot of media attention on extreme events such as recent heat waves, for example, but we also have to consider chronic impacts from climate change. One of the most well-known ones is temperature change from now through 2050, and at EPRI we've been looking at national climate assessment data and trying to represent those changes and what it means to both end-use energy use and to electricity generation and supply. And then on the right-hand panel, we can think about demand-side participation. And of course, demand-side participation is often cited as an alternative to transmission in many cases. But there's not a whole lot of quantitative data on how that might actually play out system by system. So it's certainly something that we'd love to see more in modeling tools that look at transmission planning. The other significant changes are on the supply side. We have to think about the regional differences in renewable endowments across the 48 lower U.S. states. So this is a picture here, a diagram of the input inter-US region representing onshore wind capacity and solar PV capacity. This is just two examples. US region has a much broader range of technologies, but it does illustrate that on a regional basis, there are a lot of variation in the types and quality of resource that can be available, which in itself has implications for transmission planning, notably interregional transmission. So all these things together suggest that we want to do, when thinking about new transmission, we want to start with some pretty serious scenario planning, looking at a wide range of potential views of the future, because there's a lot of uncertainty going forward. We don't know how big electrification will be. We don't know where we'll be able to build wind and solar storage, new transmission. We don't know how the shapes are going to change of load over the time. And every time that we do modeling using US region, we can see potentially different results. So it pays to do a lot of different scenarios and look at the broad range to characterize the possible outcomes that might occur, which can then inform robust planning down the line. So with that in mind, I'd like to talk now a bit about EPRI's US region model. US region was first developed about 12 years ago, initially as an electric capacity expansion model designed very much to look at the potential for renewable penetration in the United States. So the top left panel here represents the electric generation model in US region. At the time, we had a big consortium of utilities, electric utilities, and other companies and academia get together to build the model. And since then, we've expanded it. Firstly, in 2017, we recognized that the importance of electrification and understanding what was going on with end-use energy demand. And so we built the model that's depicted here on the right-hand side, our energy end-use model. This model brings together buildings, vehicles, and industry and looks at how investment decisions in energy-using technologies may change over time in response to policy or technology costs or other economics, and most importantly, in response to the electricity price, which is passed over from our electric model. So those two models, the electric generation and energy use model, are actually, they run iteratively until convergence, sharing prices and quantities. And most recently, in 2022, we've built an additional module, the fuel supply and conversion module, which looks at a range of novel production fuels, low-carbon fuels, both production and conversion technologies, including hydrogen, ammonia, various types of biofuels and synthetic fuels, and the infrastructure that would be needed to accommodate those. So now we have the three models that work together to look at the whole energy end-use and supply picture in the United States, which gives us a very powerful capability to look at deep decarbonization, not just in the electric sector, but in the whole economy, and look at the consequences of that for the electric sector. Some of you, I will briefly mention that EPRI recently put out a report on economy-wide net zero pathways, and you can find that at www.epri.com/LCRI. Now let's dig into a little bit about the transmission representation in US region. So US region typically is run in 16 sub-regions, each of which are separately optimized as part of the whole. We can actually go down to the state level for most states and down to the 11 NISO zones within New York. And technically, there's no reason we couldn't break out other balancing areas or sub-balancing areas. We haven't had the reason to do it yet. In US region, existing interregional transmission capacity is represented between the 16 regions, or however many regions we're using. That's based on NREL Reed's model transmission between the zones there. And we apply a wheeling cost of $4 per megawatt hour. That's in 2010 dollars, keep in mind, for flows between regions. And we actually optimize regional generation and interregional flows for every hour. That's co-optimization that goes into the investment decision-making down the line. US region also allows for a new interregional transmission between regions, and that's co-optimized along with new generation and storage capacity. That's currently available at $3.8 million per gigawatt mile, also in 2010 dollars, based upon a high voltage AC line. Within a region, there's no representation explicitly of transmission, but we do have a cost adder of $250 per kilowatt for wind and $100 per kilowatt for solar. In US region, we also have a similar pipeline representation for gas, CO2, and hydrogen pipelines, which we're not showing here. But note at the bottom that the maximum geographic resolution is that state level or NISO zone, and the maximum temporal resolution we can go down to is hourly. As I mentioned in the previous slide, US region co-optimizes wind, solar, storage, and interregional transmission all in the one optimization. And so that takes into account the hourly correlation between renewable and load profiles and how those may change over time. We typically run the model in two modes. One is a dynamic mode where we're looking between 2020 and 2050 in 5-year time steps. And in that case, for computational reasons, we choose 120 representative hours for each of those years, and choosing those hours and weighting them really carefully to make sure that we're capturing the correlation between wind, solar, and load in each of the hours. We also have a 1-year 8760-hour mode model, which is best for looking at sort of the longer time horizons, say, for example, 2050 and the deep decarbonization. That's a rental formulation. We're still co-optimizing between generation, storage, and transmission, but we can do so with full representation of storage charging and discharging, thanks to the chronological, retaining the chronological time there. This is a representation here of just some of the technologies within region so that you might think about in an economy-wide net zero example, which is this particular case. So on the left-hand side, we're looking at different kinds of wind, solar, and gas technologies, nuclear, battery storage, but also other storage technologies, hydrogen, electrolysis, and taking into account the load, which is coming from our end-use model. The load from the end-use model comes into the hourly level. It's an 8760 hour for every 5 years. That lets us look at the shape, which again we can co-optimize with wind and solar shapes to look at, really understand the residual demand after wind and solar, what's left, and how do you go about filling that gap. So what kind of dispatchable generation do you need? The chart in the middle is a representation of dispatch in Texas in 2050 in this particular scenario. So everything above the line is generation or storage discharge, and below the line is storage and hydrogen charging or electrolysis in this case. The black line is a load from our end-use model, and the gap between the black line and the sum of the colors is actually net imports. So remember the model is co-optimizing and actually likes to build a lot of transmission into Texas and uses that to balance the demand in Texas on an hourly basis. And that's something we see pretty frequently, is that the least cost solution does involve building transmission across the current interconnects. So I'll focus there on the electric sector model, but I do want to briefly let you all know about the rest of the model. These are the energy pathways that are represented in US region. You can see the top left-hand corner, the electricity pathways that we've looked at briefly, that there's a huge number of other pathways that look at different fuel productions, conversions from primary energy to energy end uses. Of course, we also include carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, and other carbon mitigation technologies. So all of these are represented in US region as a whole. And finally, a note, as I think all models know, there are computational trade-offs that you have to make when you're building a model. And some models prefer more granularity, and the trade-off there is a smaller geographical region and perhaps 1 year instead of 50 years in your modeling. And other modelers will go the other way and have a broader geographical region, and the trade-off is less granularity within that region. US region is designed really to look at the long run and look at big picture structural changes. So we've made computational decisions here that reflect that decision. So on the transmission side, we have, as I mentioned, a pipeline model. But we do look at the whole country. We look at 40 years into the future. The model can go between roughly 120 representative hours to an hourly formulation, depending on some trade-offs on the temporal space. It has a very a simple dispatch representation, so just a stacked dispatch. There's no unit commitment constraints in this type of model. It's a linear model. Certainly no market representation. But it does represent investments in new units across time within the sub-regions that are represented. So that's the trade-off made to build US REGEN. But then the question arises, well, how can you use that for transmission planning? And that's why we made a decision to actually link REGEN, which is inherently a scenario tool, to operational models. And now I'll turn to my colleague, Nivi Stentian, to explain more about how we've done that and the value of doing so.
Thank you, David. So this next set of slides here will show a recent implementation slide. So this next set of slides here shows a recent implementation of using US REGEN as a scenario analysis tool to inform some more detailed analyses for resource investment decision making. So specifically, the project that I'm going to talk about was part of EPRI's Integrated Strategic System Planning Board Initiative, or the ISSP, where the overall objective was to develop a framework for linking scenario analyses and capacity expansion planning tools with grid operations, transmission planning, and distribution planning tools to answer strategic questions like the ones you see here about least cost pathways for decarbonization when considering generation, transmission, distribution, and end use opportunities, and system reliability under those pathways. So the specific framework EPRI developed is tool agnostic and shown here on this slide at a pretty high level. We begin the process with an analysis of regional decarbonization pathways, ideally with a model that can consider both supply and demand side opportunities, as well as consider interactions with the rest of the energy sector. Information is then sent to a bulk system generation and transmission, or G&T, capacity expansion planning model to conduct resource portfolio planning for a geographic area of focus. And that's going to be at a unit level and across a nodal transmission network. And then the resource portfolios developed in that phase are then evaluated using a set of cost and reliability tools, ranging from a bulk system reliability model to evaluate resource adequacy and reserve needs, production cost models to assess transmission congestion and system risk, as well as power flow and stability models to assess transmission network reliability and potential reinforcement needs. And then a coordinated distribution grid model is also used to evaluate hosting capacity on the distribution system and opportunities for non-wires alternatives. And then information from both of these downstream evaluations are fed back up into the bulk system generation and transmission expansion planning model to further improve the portfolio. So while the framework EPRI developed for the ISSP is tool agnostic, we did select a specific set of tools for our project's demonstration study. Our tools ranged from using EPRI's US REGEN model as our scenario analysis tool for generating the regional technology pathways, through PSSE and EPRI's drive tools for evaluating reliability and investment needs on the T&D systems. And so while the toolbox here shows one example of many specific tools that can be used for integrated planning studies, we do think it's important that each of these types of tools with these functions are used for a comprehensive consideration of the interactions between different power system resources, as well as different opportunities on the system. So let's talk next about a little bit about how and why we used US REGEN for our study specifically. We know how increasingly important it is to understand the potential reliability implications of deeply decarbonized power systems that have high penetrations of variable renewable energy, distributed energy resources, and changes in end-use load levels and patterns. We also know that reliability studies often benefit from having power systems represented with a certain level of detail, including having existing and ideally future generating units represented at their physical locations or potential physical locations with their specific engineering or operating constraints, as well as with the physical transmission network between them and local loads represented. However, as David pointed out in the earlier slide on computational trade-offs, the computational burdens involved with modeling this level of detail means that the resource portfolio planning models often need a bit of help. So a starting point that is a discrete set of candidate generators and transmission lines that they can consider for their optimal investment decision problem. So often that sort of set of candidate resources are developed somewhat ad hoc, either using institutional knowledge, external directives from regulators or stakeholders, or even looking outward at industry trends, technology trends, and other studies. Instead, we chose to use US REGEN as our starting point, really to develop a customized list of candidate choices that made sense for the state of New York for our study, and under the specific futures that we were assessing. So as David pointed out earlier in the presentation, sort of US REGEN really allowed us to take into consideration that broad range of drivers that we know will impact the sector over the next several years, and roll that into the options we allowed Plexos to invest in. Too wide a range of candidates and the model would never solve. And to ad hoc a list of candidates, we may have missed important technology pathways for the state. So specifically for the ISSP demonstration study, we considered two futures for the state of New York: a reference or a business as usual future that considered sort of no additional decarbonization technology or policy drivers, and then a decarbonization and accelerated electrification future that considered rapid US-wide decarbonization driven by policies and high electrification. And we used US REGEN to identify the efficient regional technology pathways to meet each of these futures. So this next slide shows some of the detail on how data from US REGEN, both input assumptions as well as scenario analysis outputs, are mapped to a detailed capacity expansion planning model like Plexos, which is what we used. We map inputs more or less directly to the detailed capacity expansion planning model's database to ensure that a consistent set of assumptions across the different tools were used. But then, as the output section on this table shows, we use the scenario outputs from US REGEN as that starting point, really to guide Plexos to find least cost G&T expansion portfolios for our specific area of study. So once we have identified cost-effective G&T resource portfolios from the capacity planning model for each of the scenarios, as our framework a few slides back showed, we then evaluate those portfolios to identify potential economic and reliability-driven reinforcements for the system to perform robustly under different system considerations. The framework we developed uses a 5-point cost and reliability evaluation. And as shown in red here, so two of them are importantly focused on transmission network operations and planning, really given the significant impact the network can have on system reliability and overall costs. We perform a network congestion assessment using a security constrained production cost model with unit commitment, as well as a transmission network reliability assessment on critical windows of time that are chosen using EPRI's Hills clustering tool and PSSE's power flow modeling tool. So each of these steps provided information that we then fed back into the bulk system capacity expansion planning model. And this table just shows a summary of the main findings from each of the reliability evaluation steps and the recommended action for the G&T planning model. As you can see from the transmission evaluations here, our PCM evaluation found notable lines in the built system with significant congestion and overloading, as well as high variation in system-wide prices, which guided us to ask the capacity expansion planning model to consider new economic transmission upgrades. And then our network reliability assessment found several lines and transformers needing upgrades to make the system secure, which told us to allow the capacity planning model to consider additional reliability-driven transmission reinforcements. So this next slide is just a visual of the major transmission paths our transmission network analyses found as requiring upgrades in the system in the study's reference scenario. The decarbonization and accelerated electrification scenario, not shown here, shows a different set of upgrades. So this example project that I just overviewed is all to say that US REGEN allowed us to complete a new toolbox that EPRI is now using for various emerging transmission planning questions. We can now assess where sort of new transmission may be needed to maintain power system reliability under different futures, including stringent CO2 policy futures and higher levels of renewables. Understand better how loads and load shapes may change as the system transitions to lower states of carbon, and how that may impact transmission needs. We can also now study potential critical future risks that call for more robust transmission planning, and even how resource investment strategies may be impacted by different grid enhancing technologies or even changes to interconnection processes. So I hope that provides you with an overview of one example of a way we've used US REGEN to enhance and inform transmission planning at a more sort of geographically focused level. And David, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Needy. If you could go forward 2 slides. So to summarize here, US REGEN, the value of US REGEN is in its ability to generate many scenarios in a pretty quick amount of time that cover a very broad space in terms of futures, uncertainties, the risks that you maybe have to assess, which in turn allows for robust planning down the line when you get into the details. US REGEN integrates the electric sector with the end-use demand, with fuel production, so it covers the whole energy economy space. And that in turn allows for evaluation of policies by region, by state, or nationally that may affect decision-making and investment decisions in the electric sector. It can evaluate electrification, it can evaluate emerging technologies, climate-related risks and impacts, and even deployment of customer generation and how you might co-optimize that on the generation side. And once you have all that detail and you've picked some candidate scenarios, we've built this automated link to operational models to get to that more granular level of detail. So really, the use of US REGEN is about identifying those long-run drivers to characterize your key uncertainties when thinking about your future transmission needs, and doing so in a way that should allow for some robust identification of transmission uses in the future. And with that, that brings us to the end of the presentation, and I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and to encourage you, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or to Needy. Our email addresses are on this slide. And thanks again for your time today, and I hope you enjoy your day.